Welcome to American History Lesson 12. Reconstruction. Our lesson objectives are: identify and understand how President Lincoln, Johnson, and Grant impacted the country, identify key groups or organizations who influenced the Reconstruction, identify the impact the Civil War would have on the reunited country, identify and understand how the economy was shaped by and helped shape the time period. Rebuilding the United States. The period from 1865 to 1877 is referred to as the Reconstruction era. During that time, the United States began to heal from the effects of the Civil War, and the federal government made decisions on how Southern states would be allowed back into the Union. President Lincoln encouraged people to move forward from the war and have the Southern states back in the Union quickly. In Lincoln's plan, once at least 10% of voters in the state took an oath of allegiance to the Union, that state was readmitted. Lincoln's plan included a pardon for many of the Confederate soldiers and politicians. 4 Southern states agreed to this plan and applied for readmission to the Union, but the radical Republicans did not allow it, as they did not want former slave owners to have any power. In addition, they wanted African Americans to have the right to vote. Their bill was vetoed by President Lincoln. Andrew Johnson from Tennessee became President of the United States after Lincoln's assassination. He promoted a more lenient policy towards Reconstruction. Under his policy, a state must declare that secession is illegal and ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. There were many Southern states who agreed to those terms, and in 1865 sent new Southern representatives to Congress in Washington. The Radicals refused to seat any new members of Congress because many of the Southern delegates were former members of the Confederate government or had fought as Confederate soldiers. Congress did pass a law that extended the Freedmen's Bureau, which helped former slaves adjust to their new life as a free person. Congress passed a civil rights bill that allowed African American citizenship. The Black Codes of the South, which were laws that limited African Americans' freedoms, were banned. President Johnson vetoed both bills because he thought this made the federal government too powerful. Congress voted to override each veto. Congress passed the 14th Amendment confirming African American citizenship. This amendment prevented some former Confederate leaders from holding political office. Johnson urged the Southern states not to approve the amendment because he thought it was too severe. President Johnson campaigned against the radical Republicans in the 1866 congressional elections. In doing so, he alienated many Northern voters. During this time, race riots in the South caused the death of many African Americans. The Radicals gained enough seats in Congress to override any presidential veto. In 1867, the new Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which declared the reorganized Southern state governments invalid, placed Southern states under military control, made it compulsory to write new state constitutions, and required that new state laws give African Americans the right to vote. The next year, Congress ended the conflict with President Johnson by voting to impeach him. After an 11-week trial, the Senate found him not guilty. The next fall, Ulysses S. Grant won the presidential election due to his support from African American voters in the South. Following this, Congress passed the 15th Amendment forbidding the denial of voting rights due to race. Life in the South. As required, the Southern states wrote new constitutions. By 1870, the Southern states were readmitted into the Union under the Radicals' terms. The population and the economy were destroyed, and the South was unable to support itself under these conditions. New state governments implemented rebuilding programs and established the first public school system in many of the Southern states. To fund these programs, though, they had to raise the taxes and borrow money. The Republican Party in the South was comprised of 3 main groups: scalawags, white Southerners who joined the party but were primarily former Unionists; carpetbaggers, Northerners who moved south after the war to rebuild Southern society or to make a fortune; and African Americans who were understandably eager to exercise their right to vote. African Americans began working to improve their lives. Freed slaves looked for their spouses who were sold in other areas of the South. If they were reunited, they could marry and raise families. People of all ages went to school. African Americans joined churches and volunteer groups to help improve their own society. African Americans joined the new state governments, and more than a dozen served in the U.S. Congress. The economy was more difficult to change, though. Congress considered breaking up the large plantations and awarding land to the freed slaves, but most members did not want to challenge the right to property. Southern planters now used labor contracts for their black labor, but neither side was in favor of these. The planters did not have a lot of cash to pay the workers, and the African Americans disliked the low wages. Two optional plans were created by Congress. Sharecropping gave small plots of farmland to both black and white workers in return for a share of the crop. Tenant farming required workers to rent the land from the plantation owners. Each system had its own challenges, but the biggest challenge was relying mostly on the cotton price. The demand for cotton around the world was in decline, and so was the price. There were hate groups forming that tortured and killed former slaves and other African Americans. The Ku Klux Klan is the most infamous of these groups. The KKK killed several thousand people, both black and white, who helped African Americans. There were some Klan leaders who tried to stop the senseless violence, but with little success during this time period. In the mid-1870s, Klan violence succeeded in preventing many African Americans from voting, which resulted in the election of many Democrats in several southern states. The end of Reconstruction. Several scandals plagued the Grant administration. Grant was never caught in corruption, but some of his cabinet appointees were, including his first vice president, his private secretary, and the secretaries of War, Navy, and Interior. By 1872, the Republican Party was split. Republicans chose newspaper editor Horace Greeley to run for president, hoping this would rebuild their party. Even though the Democrats supported Greeley too, Grant won re-election. A financial panic in 1873 caused the closure of many banks and was followed by a depression. There was debate about whether to continue using paper money. These issues took attention away from Reconstruction. Northerners were beginning to tire of the cost of the Reconstruction effort by the mid-1870s. Supreme Court decisions weakened the impact of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Citizens started to work towards reuniting the country. Democrats gained control of Southern state government because of a disputed election. Democrat Samuel J. Tilden finished one electoral vote short of victory in the presidential election of 1876. Congress then appointed a commission to settle the disputed electoral votes. The commission decided on the Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes after he made a deal with Southern Democrats to end the Reconstruction efforts. After taking office, President Hayes pulled federal troops from the South. Democrats, who are now referred to as Redeemers, controlled each of the Southern state governments. The Reconstruction effort did not gain equality for African Americans in the South, but the 14th and 15th Amendments continued to remain a part of the Constitution. These amendments were essential in protecting the rights of African Americans throughout the years. Fun fact: President Hayes was one of the 5 presidents who served in the Civil War, but he was the only one to be wounded in the war. He was wounded on 4 occasions and had 4 horses shot from under him. President Hayes also proposed a 1-term limit on the presidency, coupled with a 6-year term. Although his proposal was never enacted, he still kept his pledge to not seek re-election in 1880. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname, and the date of publication within parentheses, straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.